When you open up Plants vs. Zombies for the first time, you might notice a help button in the shape of a vase on the main menu. Probably not though, because you want to jump right into the game like everyone else. Eventually, after coming back to the menu a few more times, you might get curious and click on it even though you've already played the game a bunch. When you do, you'll find a note from the zombies on how they think you should play the game. Now, while this is a great joke that fits the tongue-in-cheek humor of the rest of the game, it also proves something. That Plants vs. Zombies is completely playable without any kind of additional instruction that's external to the core gameplay experience. George Fan, the game's designer, intended for the tutorial of the game to seamlessly blend with the core gameplay and use several design rules to teach the player throughout the main adventure mode. To start off, PvZ urges the player to do instead of read. You can think of this as the video game equivalent of a phrase you probably heard a writing teacher go on and on about at some point. The game often does this by limiting the possible actions a player can take at any given time. For example, in the very first level, you only have access to one plant and one lane of grass to put them on. Restricting the player in this scenario allows them to learn multiple things without needing to read additional text, like how plants are placed in lanes, and also occupy a section of that lane until they're destroyed. Having the player do rather than read like this is important for a few reasons. First, it benefits both new and experienced players. For new players, doing allows them to explore the possibility space of the game and notice rules and patterns on their own, giving a sense of fulfillment where they wouldn't have gotten any from following prescriptive written instructions. It also gives experienced players the freedom to jump straight into the action, without needing to skip through a bunch of tutorial text that they don't need. It also utilizes the game's unique ability to teach players experientially rather than academically. Think reading about an experiment versus doing it yourself. One is a lot more fun and memorable than the other. As a corollary to this rule, the importance of getting the player to do something once is also highlighted throughout the game. In some cases, pretty literally. Like when the first coin is dropped, a big arrow appears over it to draw the player's attention, since they're used to only collecting sun at this point. Once they grab that coin, they see it's added to the wallet in the user interface, and will keep collecting money in the future. So no more arrows are needed after the first time the player commits the action. Especially in games with as many types of units as Plants vs. Zombies, it can be very easy to accidentally overwhelm the player by introducing too many early on or at the same time. In fact, in earlier iterations of the game, new zombie types were shown off in each level. It became apparent though that by spacing out when they were introduced, players would have more time to learn about and adapt to them, having more fun in the process. It also ties into another good example of limiting the possibility space, because when new zombies are featured in a level, they're usually accompanied by weaker zombie types so the player can focus on learning what the new one does. Then in subsequent levels, they're mixed in with the rest of the more difficult zombies to challenge the player, kinda like when boss enemies come back as normal ones in later levels of an action game. New plants are introduced at a similar paced-out cadence and often directly counter recently introduced zombies. This keeps the difficulty curve on a relatively stable upward trajectory as new zombies raise the stakes and new plants level it out. The effect is that while players are constantly introduced to more complicated situations, they never feel completely unprepared for a new level. Just enough challenge to keep them engaged, but not enough so that they get overwhelmed. In this sense, it's also important to make sure that when a player is given a new tool or piece of information, they can find a use for it immediately. Some of the more unique aspects of PvZ are introduced at key intervals over the course of the game. For example, the player doesn't have access to the shovel that can be used to remove plants right away. Instead, the first few levels allow the player to focus on learning the base actions of planting plants and collecting sun. Only once players reach level 5 do they actually get access to it. In a similar fashion, money is introduced at level 10, the store at level 25, albeit with a limited selection, and the Zen Garden at level 45, only 5 levels before the end of the main adventure mode. The more complex of these mechanics are given to the player later in the game. This is because as they play more and their level of investment grows, so does their willingness to learn. Otherwise, players given some of these options at the beginning might get frustrated or even quit the game because of the overload of information. Now, even though it's usually better to have the player do instead of read, sometimes information needs to be simply told to the player, and the keyword there is simply. The less words to explain a concept, the better, so that someone can understand it quickly and at a fundamental level. Designer George Fan calls this speaking like a sophisticated caveman. This rule informed how tutorial text and plant descriptions were written to get the player to learn new concepts without having to skim through a wall of words. It's also useful to keep in mind when writing video scripts too, and part of why you'll never see me analyzing Skyrim for 20 hours. The game just isn't that complicated. Another thing to note about text tutorials in Plants vs. Zombies is that they rarely, if ever, interrupt the gameplay. Passive messaging that doesn't require player interaction or interrupts their actions should always be prioritized. The prevalence of ad blockers on computers all across the world should tell you all you need to know about how much people like getting things thrown on their screen that they didn't ask for. It's also important to plan for how different types of players will interact with written tutorials. One way to tackle this is to make the messaging adaptive. Along these lines, Plants vs. Zombies has messages that only pop up when certain conditions are met. For example, if pea shooters are frequently dying in the first few levels, a hint will suggest to plant your pea shooters to the left, so that they have more time to take out zombies before they reach them. By holding this message back, players are able to explore what happens when they put pea shooters in different positions, but are only helped out when it's clear that they need it. You can think about these kinds of messages like bumpers in bowling. If you're good enough, you won't need them or even see them, but they're able to appear for the players that do. One final rule that the game tutorial follows so well is leveraging what people know. This dives into a psychological concept called schema, which is basically how people perceive, organize, and interpret new information based on its relation to things they've experienced. Like how when you see red hearts in a game, you know they probably relate to health because of your experiences with other games and knowledge of hearts in real life. PvZ applies schema to many of its unit designs. The very first plant, the pea shooter, is designed to look like a gun, which allows players to grok or intuitively understand how it will function before it ever fires a single pea. With the zombies, even though they don't have player-facing health bars, their toughness can still be seen visually by how much armor they're wearing. Metal buckets are obviously harder than plastic traffic cones, so the zombies wearing them must be harder to take down. More generally, plants are stationary in real life, making them good candidates for towers in a tower defense game. And zombies are typically portrayed as slow, making them good enemies to give players time to strategize. Even the plant names are meant to be descriptive in this way. All of the pea shooter variants have pea in the name, while every mushroom has shroom. Others are one-offs, like sunflower, marigold, walnut, and of course, squash. Deciding on what resources to use for the in-game economy was simple by leveraging what people know too. Because plants obviously need sun, so it should be beneficial to collect it in the game about plants. Well, capitalism obviously needs money, so silver, gold, and diamonds are going to be useful in the shop, as everyone recognizes them as valuable currencies. Tutorials are usually one of the most difficult parts of a game to make. It's because of this that they're usually left as one of the last sections to develop, along with giving time for a game's systems to be fully fleshed out enough to be taught. Fortunately, Plants vs. Zombies clearly exemplifies several rules that can be learned to help in this process. A tutorial for tutorials, if you will. Having the player do instead of read, spacing out teaching new concepts, keeping messages short and adaptive, and leveraging what players already know are all critically useful to creating a great tutorial. Whether you ever make one or not, hopefully these rules give you some more insight as to why some games are so easy to hop into and learn.